There is a stench. Those were the powerful words written to describe the humanitarian crisis at the border, one now resulting in the suffering of children and infants, as the president and his administration concoct a toxic brew of political opportunism and operational incompetence. Blockbuster reporting from multiple news organizations drawing our attention to the tragedy unfurling on U.S. soil at the direction of the Trump administration. We'll start with reporting in the New York Times. Quote, a chaotic scene of sickness and filth is unfolding in an overcrowded border station in Clint, Texas, where hundreds of young people who have recently crossed the border are being held. It's according to lawyers who visited the facility this week. Some of the children have been there for nearly a month. Children as young as 7 and 8. Many of them wearing clothes caked with snot and tears are caring for infants they've just met, the lawyers said. Toddlers without diapers are relieving themselves in their pants. Teenage mothers are wearing clothes stained with breast milk. It's one of those things that even for this White House is so horrific, there won't be any political debate over this one, right? I mean, even a Republican said so.
I've lived in that state. I've been down there throughout my 15 years in Congress and before that as a federal prosecutor. This is the worst I've ever seen it, and it has to be taken care of.
Today, finally, we're learning that the government is removing most of the children housed in that Texas facility, but the public messaging from the Trump administration sounds light on urgency and heavy on finger-pointing. Here's a lawyer for the Justice Department defending those conditions we just described last week.
It's within everybody's common understanding that, you know, if you don't have a toothbrush, if you don't have soap, if you don't have a blanket, it's not safe and sanitary. Well, wouldn't everybody agree to that? Do you agree to that?
Well, I think there's fair reason to find that those things may be part of safe and sanitary.
Maybe, are a part. What do you say maybe? You mean there are circumstances when a person doesn't need to have a toothbrush, toothpaste, and soap for days?
Well, I think in CBP custody, it's frequently intended to be much shorter term. So it may be that for a shorter term stay in CBP custody that some of those things may not be required.
When is a toothbrush not required? The president has managed to blame Democrats, of course.
Where is the money? You know what? The Democrats are holding up the humanitarian aid. If they changed asylum and if they changed loopholes, everything on the border would be perfect.
The humanitarian crisis at the border and the delay of those ICE raids for immigrant families that Donald Trump telegraphed in a tweet last week are where we start today. Julia Ainsley is a correspondent covering both the Departments of Homeland Security and Justice for NBC News. Jeremy Bash is a former chief of staff at both the CIA and the Defense Department. Heather McGhee is a senior fellow at Demos. And White House reporter for the Associated Press, Jonathan Lemire, is here. Jeremy Bash, I worked for a president. If I worked for the president and he was going to visit a country where babies were being held in these conditions, let me read this to you from the New Yorker. The conditions that the lawyers found were shocking. Flu and lice outbreaks were going untreated. The children were filthy, sleeping on cold floors and taking care of one another because of the lack of attention from guards. Some of them have been in the facility for weeks. I worked for a president. If he wanted to go on a trip to a country doing those things, or the earlier things I described, babies, taking care of babies, I would strongly counsel him not to go to that country. How are world leaders even meeting with an American president brutalizing asylum seekers?
And we would probably go one step further. We would condemn that country. We would bring them before the United Nations. We would decry the humanitarian tragedy. Nicole, I mean, this is heartbreaking, and I think this is one of those moments where we have to stop and say that when the history of this administration is written, there's going to be a section devoted to Clint, Texas, and the treatment of children by our country. You know, as you remember from your days in the Bush administration, when then Senator John McCain wanted to ban sleep deprivation as a interrogation technique for hardened al-Qaeda criminals, he basically said, I find that it's cruel, inhuman, and degrading. Those were the words of the federal statute banning those techniques, and yet somehow we're engaging in sleep deprivation for children when it's been outlawed for hardened al-Qaeda criminals. Those are people who are doing hard time, and we're using it on little children who can't even tell time.
It's an unbelievable point to make, one that stopped me in my tracks. Jeremy, let me just follow up with you. The only reason we know about what happened in Clint is because lawyers went in to inspect the site. How do we know there aren't other children in harm's way?
I think Congress needs to get on its front legs here and aggressively investigate the detention of these separated families, the detention of these children. And we have a short-term crisis, which is these children need care immediately, not in days or weeks or a 2-week deadline like tonight or by tomorrow morning. And then, of course, there's the medium-term issue, which I know we're going to discuss, which is how to handle the asylum crisis on the border. But the children who live there today and tonight should not have to shoulder the political dysfunction and the administration's policies that have created this situation.
Heather, I'm struck by, and look, I worked in a White House that was unpopular for a million different reasons, but I did not encounter people who didn't have sort of the check on their own humanity of I'm a parent. I imagine what it would be like to be a parent. How do zombies carry out these policies? Who are these people? Who is the person that argues in court? They don't need toothbrushes. They weren't supposed to be there for long. How long is too long to have a toothbrush?
You know, I think it's a really good question to ask, who are these people, right? I mean, because this is the vision of folks like Stephen Miller, right? A white nationalist whose own uncle said, if these had been the policies in place when your ancestors had to flee anti-Semitic violence in Eastern Europe, you would not exist, right? You've got Donald Trump himself, who has absolutely led us to this place by first saying that people who are coming to this country, aspiring citizens, are not human, that they're animals, that they're rapists, that they're gang members and criminals, basically that they're the enemy, that we should be on war footing against our neighbors to the south who are coming to try to live out the American dream. You start there with the dehumanization, and that's how you get to children in cages, children catching the flu under our watch and dying, as has happened. It is heartbreaking, it is infuriating, but I do want to say it's important for us to not feel hopeless. I mean, I think so many of us that are parents look at this and we say, what can we do? And you can donate to organizations that are working.
We're fixing your microphone because we want to hear every last thing you say, Heather.
You can donate to organizations that are working at the border to help families, to give children defense. There's organizations like Kids in Need of Defense and Rice's and Families Belong Together. I think it's important for people to not feel helpless because
right, but I guess my pushback is why should we have to protect people from ourselves? Why do we have to protect children from the U.S. government?
Obviously, the biggest thing we can do is organize politically to put pressure on Congress and to get this administration, which has absolutely signaled how it feels about people who are coming from Latin America and Central America. They've said how they feel about them. They said they think they're animals, that there's an invasion, and we're talking about children and women and asylum seekers. And I'll just say, this is only the beginning. We are entering a period of time in global history when there are more refugees now across the globe than there have been at any point in our history, and it's only going to get worse because of climate change, something that, frankly, America holds a lot of responsibility for. So we just have to change the entire paradigm to recognize the humanity of people who are seeking help.
Julie Ansley, is this the sort of out and proud policy of the Barr Justice Department to be doing this to children? Are they pointing to the results as the intended consequences, or are these mess ups in the eye of DHS and DOJ?
It's interesting. There's actually been a little finger pointing behind the scenes from DHS at DOJ because of that very clip that you played, Nicole, where that Justice Department lawyer was saying, maybe we don't need a toothbrush or soap or a place to sleep for children to really feel like they're in safe and sanitary conditions. DHS is sort of falling back now and saying, wait, maybe she went a little too far. But in reality, they aren't providing a lot of this. And when the president makes the argument that it's the Democrats' fault because they're not giving funding, he's conflating two issues. One is a funding issue for more space. We had numbers 3 weeks ago, Nicole, that said this problem was starting to happen. And now we have the stories of the reality of what this looks like. There was so much overcrowding and backlogs that we knew these children weren't being cared for. But now that we have the stories, we realize it's not a funding issue, it's a management issue. It doesn't take an act of Congress. It doesn't take an emergency spending bill in order to provide hair and a toothbrush for children.
Julie, I want to ask you to take me through the reporting over the weekend. DHS reporting that those ICE raids that the president tweeted about and telegraphed were called off because of media leaks. Who was the leaker, if not the president?
That's a great question, right? Who is the leaker, if not the president? In the past, I know I and other reporters have gotten dinged for reporting on ICE operations before they happen because we're told that's law enforcement sensitive and you're going to put agents in danger if the people who they're targeting know they're coming. Well, the president himself went out and started bragging about this operation. So we knew it was coming. We knew when it would be. Over the weekend or just before the weekend, we got a list of the cities that would be targeted. And those police started to say, look, we aren't going to be able to cooperate with these ICE enforcement policies like you might want us to. We are here to ensure public safety, but we aren't going to go above and beyond to hand over these people because, frankly, they're upset that they won't be able to cooperate with local law enforcement like they depend on. The cops depend on the immigrant communities in a lot of these cities and towns. So then as we started to move further, all of a sudden they called it off and said it was a leak problem and that they would do a leak investigation. Though it's not very hard you don't have to dig very far to see where this information was coming from. And another reason they called it off, there are a few others. One is that the acting secretary, Kevin McAleenan, apparently behind closed doors has some problems with it. And also they just didn't, frankly, have the capacity. If you look at the overcrowding issues and Customs and Border Protection, it's because there's overcrowding throughout. There's overcrowding in ICE and Health and Human Services. So imagine, Nicole, in the conditions we have now, trying to put up to 2,000 more immigrants into detention, because that's what you have to do after you arrest an immigrant inside the country before you deport them. The logistics just didn't add up on this.
Okay, so before these are people living here with children in things like camp and school. I mean, it's more than a logistical problem. It's a philosophical problem and a policy problem. And it seems to me, Jonathan Lemire, to represent the crisis of the kind of, I mean, there was a purge at DHS, right? And who thought we'd miss any of those folks? But it would appear that part of what they walked out on was sort of the Stephen Miller conceived purges of immigrants and asylum seekers, and this is some reporting from the Washington Post. I know the AP has a lot of reporting of their own. The acting DHS secretary warned that an indiscriminate operation to arrest migrants in their homes and at work sites risks separating children from their parents in cases where children are at daycare, summer camp, or friends' houses. He also has maintained that ICE should not devote major resources to carrying out a mass interior sweep, while telling lawmakers it needs emergency funding to address the crisis at the border. McAleenan said that the crisis at the border, where more than 144,000 were taken into custody last month, remains the most urgent problem. So they have a problem at the border, which is right here, and they're going to round up people living in communities with babies in summer school and day. I mean, what should we expect, another purge because he didn't carry out the president's cruel policy, or will he get fired for having a conscience about that discrete question?
He certainly may. I mean, his predecessor, Secretary Nielsen, left in part because of disputes over these sort of policies. There is grumbling in the White House about that there's been some resistance here. This didn't get enacted immediately. Of course, the leak investigation should begin and end with the Twitter account @RealDonaldTrump.
Yeah,
Since
we can solve that.
That's
save
done.
your resources for new lawyers.
You're welcome. But he's not going to back off from this. I know there's a 2-week reprieve here, and it's sort of become a Washington joke that everything where the president threatens, then he backs off. He always says, "Well, we'll reevaluate in 2 weeks."
Ask Iran.
It's always 2 weeks, right? So there is a possibility that this will never come to pass, but this is something, let's remember, that is the very center of why he thinks he got elected and why he thinks he can get reelected. It is going to be tough.
What is, though, the words? Because he actually hasn't done anything.
Yeah.
Immigration's worse. What is the
No
center?
question, but it is the rhetoric. And
the
that's
words.
just yes, it is. It's the words, the words, it's the rhetoric. And he has to convince that the people who voted for him last time will do so again, even though he has not delivered on his promises about immigration. You're right, the problem has only grown worse. And there's a healthy debate to be had about whether on asylum and things like that, whether things do need to be changed. There could be some reform that's necessary. There shouldn't be much of a debate about the conditions these children have been experienced in these shelters in Texas. That, 7-year-olds who have to take care of 4-month-olds who they'd never met, with soiled diapers or with mucus all over their shirts. You don't have to just be a parent. You don't even have to be an American. You just have to be a citizen of this world to be horrified by those conditions. And it is going to be, I think, a difficult case for this White House to make that is an effective tactic in their fight.
Jeremy Bash, I have a 7-year-old, but you don't have to have a 7-year-old to be experience waves of nausea to hear that. Where are the Democrats? I mean, why aren't there hearings yesterday about the conditions at the border?
I don't know, Nicole. I think it's a great question. And I think one of the first things that the committee chairs should be demanding from DHS today is a list of every location where there are children under the age of 18 who are being held without other family members or a guardian or a parent. That list should be easy to produce. They should immediately produce it to Congress, and Congress should send congressional staff, professional staff investigators to those sites. And I believe, as Justice Brandeis said or wrote, sunlight is the best disinfectant. The way to end this horrific practice is to shine a light on it, bring the shining light of congressional oversight into these locations, let the media understand what's happening, obviously protect the privacy of the children, and I think the problem will take care of itself because the conscience of America will not abide this horror.
You know, and Julia, I'm confused at a policy level because I think it was almost exactly a year ago that ProPublica released the tape of babies wailing. And I guess I don't feel bamboozled because I don't have that high of an expectation of the Trump administration, but they did try to put out a cover story that they were done with the separation of families. Under what policy is this even happening?
So let me explain this. When we talk about separation of families, they're talking about separating a parent, biological parent, or a legal guardian from a child. That did systematically end with an executive order from the president. When they were doing that on a large scale to every parent who crossed illegally and simply committed a misdemeanor, not a felony. That did end. What we're seeing now is, yes, there have been some separations. We're still trying to get details on what those particular details were, but they've dropped. It's been about 700 over 6 months compared to 2,800 in 2 months. So really down to levels we saw before that policy was even enacted. The people who are being separated now, Nicole, are children who come with a grandparent or maybe an adult sibling. A lot of these children come thinking they're with their family, and this is how they will come into the United States, with this person who loves and cares for them. But under U.S. law, and this is not a Trump administration policy, it's just our law, those are not considered families. And so those children actually have to be sent to Health and Human Services and then go through a long process where that agency decides who they will be sent to, who will sponsor them. It could end up being that same relative down the road, but they have to go through this really circuitous process. And people at DHS, I know, have actually wanted Congress to take a look at that law because it would make the situation easier. Unaccompanied children are the hardest demographic that they care for because they're so vulnerable and because they're not set up to care for them. Another thing I want to add, Nicole, is that we now know that these children are leaving that terrible facility in Clint, but they're moving to a soft-sided facility, meaning tents, like where we saw a lot of the children who were separated last summer. And it's not clear that they will necessarily have better conditions. They're still under the control of Border Patrol, and it's not clear how quickly they'll get out. But at least the government did take some action on this one particular place today. And like we said, there could be others. This is the one place where these lawyers came, but there are other places across the border that could look just as bleak.
And I guess, Heather, you want to take Julia's word for it that they've moved them to somewhere better. You want to believe someone if they say, well, this was an isolated incident. But I think when you're a parent, you recognize patterns. Mm-hmm. There's a pattern of brutalizing and mistreating the youngest, most innocent people who come to this country, children, infants, and they're now dying on our watch. So, I hear you on, there are things we can do to support the A groups, but we're essentially protecting them from ourselves, from our own government. I mean, what sort of action should take place? I mean, Jeremy talked about transparency. It would seem that this is a national emergency, that if we had a 9/11 commission to figure out what happened on 9/11, if we had a Mueller report to figure out what happened in the 2016 election, shouldn't we figure out how we're killing babies?
I couldn't agree more that this is something that we are going to need just action right now, that Congress should absolutely be doing more than it's been doing. I share the recommendations about what should happen, but I don't share the optimism. I think that we have seen and heard these stories now for exactly about a year, and things haven't changed. The evil has mutated and migrated into different ways of dehumanizing children and families who are coming to this country for the exact same reason that millions of people have come to this country, to seek out refuge from persecution and to try to build a life for their families. So I don't have any optimism that all of this media attention is going to change the way the CBP treats children and asylum seekers. We have had a tone being set from the top that is dehumanizing. We have ICE having been recruited for some time now over the past decade to really be an internal deportation force. The idea that these raids this weekend were family raids targeting parents with children who would love to do nothing more than to stand in line and become citizens, it's just heartbreaking.
All right.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.